This is the thrust that sends
The crew monitors systems during NASA's Artemis II.
Earth fades behind NASA's Artemis II and the 3.
New suits are tested for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 moonwalk.
Descent engines guide NASA's Artemis II and the 3 toward the surface.
Recovery operations conclude. NASA's
Artemis II and 3 perform a breathtaking lunar.
Boosters fall away after powering NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3rd.
Neutral buoyancy training prepares crews for NASA.
Sensors aboard Artemis 1 prepared system.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 mark humanity's long-awaited return to the moon after half a century. For the first time since Apollo, NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 will take humans beyond low Earth orbit.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 build on Apollo's legacy with next-generation technology.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 aim to reconnect humanity with our nearest celestial neighbor.
The goal of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3rd is not just to visit, but to stay.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 represent a new chapter in deep space exploration.
After 50 years, NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 reignite the dream of lunar exploration. Technology powering NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 is far beyond anything used before.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 bring humans back to deep space once again.
This is the mission that returns humanity to the lunar frontier.
NASA says Artemis 2 and the 3 are the first steps toward a permanent human presence on the moon.
Science is at the heart of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 lunar exploration plan. NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 aim to build the foundation for future moon bases. NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 are stepping stones for humanity's journey to Mars. The South Pole is the key target of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 missions. NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 will search for water ice that could support life. Sustainability is the long-term vision behind NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. Power systems tested in NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 will shape future habitats. NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 will expand human communication into deep space. These missions begin humanity's transition from exploration to settlement.
These engines will push NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 beyond Earth's orbit.
Towering over the launch pad, SLS carries the hopes of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. Every rollout marks another milestone for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Thousands of engineers helped build the rocket for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. SLS combines proven shuttle tech with modern upgrades for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
The raw power of launch defines the beginning of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. This is the thrust that sends NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 to the moon.
With SLS, NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 break free from Earth.
Orion is the crew vehicle for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Inside Orion, astronauts of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 will live and work.
Precision docking is vital for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 success.
Orion's heat shield protects crews of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. Power systems keep NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 alive in deep space. Orion carries NASA's Artemis II and the 3 farther than Apollo ever went.
Recovery systems are crucial for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 return.
Every seat inside Orion represents a future pioneer of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Navigation tech guides NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 through deep space.
Before astronauts fly, NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 relied on Artemis 1 testing. Data from Artemis 1 shapes NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Sensors aboard Artemis 1 prepared systems for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. This orbit proved capabilities for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Artemis radiation test sequence engaged. Deep space environment nominal. Shielding performance optimal.
Every pass refined navigation for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. The path home was tested for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. Ocean recovery proved readiness for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Millions of data points support NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Artemis 1 paved the way for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
These are the explorers of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. History will remember the crew of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Teamwork defines NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 astronauts.
Every detail prepares crews for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
I love you!
Wow, it's huge.
We'll be watching.
Simulations shape the success of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
The world watches the astronauts of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Determination shines in the crew of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. Every step forward carries NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 closer to the moon. They will carry humanity's dreams on NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. Neutral buoyancy training prepares crews for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Extreme survival skills are part of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 prep.
Virtual reality rehearsals guide NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 astronauts.
Safety drills are vital for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Physical endurance supports NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 missions.
Water survival training readies crews of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Every movement is rehearsed for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Launch Day marks the beginning of humanity's journey on NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Countdown rehearsals prepare crews for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
The engines ignite, sending NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 beyond Earth. With liftoff, NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 leave the planet behind.
Inside Orion, astronauts feel the power of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 climb toward the edge of space. Stage separation pushes NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 toward deep space.
Earth grows smaller as NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 head for the moon.
Boosters fall away after powering NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 skyward.
Orbit achieved. NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 begin their lunar voyage. NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 travel farther than any human mission in decades.
The moon comes into view for crews of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Power systems sustain NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 on the journey.
Mission control stays connected with NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Life in weightlessness defines the cruise phase of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Precise navigation guides NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 through space.
From afar, NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 see both home and destination.
Course corrections keep NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 on track.
Astronauts document history during NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
The spacecraft approaches lunar space on NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 perform a breathtaking lunar flyby.
Craters rush beneath NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. The moon's gravity redirects NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 toward Earth.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 perform a breathtaking lunar flyby.
For the crew, NASA says Artemis 2 and 3 deliver a view never forgotten. NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 glimpse the moon's hidden side.
The horizon glows beneath NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 leave their mark in lunar history.
Scientific observations are part of NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 flyby.
The flyby ends, but NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 journey continues. Life support checks ensure safety on NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Water systems are tested aboard NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Air circulation keeps NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 crews alive. Constant monitoring protects NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Thermal systems stabilize NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 cabin.
Health maintenance is crucial for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Engineers analyze life support data from NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
All systems perform as planned on NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Re-entry tests the heat shield of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Parachutes slow NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 for landing.
NASA's Artemis II and the 3 return safely to Earth's oceans.
Teams recover the capsule from NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Recovery operations conclude NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 mission.
Health checks ensure astronaut safety after NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
One chapter closes for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Data from NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 shapes the next lunar landing mission.
Mission planning intensifies for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Landing rehearsals begin for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Hardware tests validate performance for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Astronauts rehearse moon landing scenarios for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
All focus shifts toward the South Pole in NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
The human landing system carries astronauts during NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. Orbital refueling supports NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 landing mission.
Descent engines guide NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 toward the surface.
The lunar lander approaches touchdown during NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Docking operations link spacecraft in NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. The lander defines the landing phase of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
From the surface, Earth shines over NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 landing site. Gateway supports missions like NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 in lunar orbit.
Gateway provides living space for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 crews.
Supply deliveries enable sustainability for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3. Robotics assist operations tied to NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. Its orbit makes Gateway vital to NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
New suits are tested for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 moonwalk.
Surface mobility is trained for NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.
Clear communication is key for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Experiments are readied for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. The moon awaits the pioneers of NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Another powerful launch begins NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 landing mission.
Engines roar as NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 lift off.
The crew feels the power behind NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3.
Earth fades behind NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. Gateway operations begin for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. Thrusters guide NASA's Artemis 2 and 3 toward touchdown.
The crew monitors systems during NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3 landing.
Touchdown approaches for NASA's Artemis 2 and the 3. Humanity has returned with NASA's Artemis 2 and 3.